West's language towards Israel is becoming harsher, and rightly so, in my view, because there is no sign of Netanyahu sort of drawing this military operation in Gaza to a close.
Yeah.
He's talking about it going for several months longer, at a time when, if you remember, Anthony Blinken before Christmas was saying, well, maybe another few weeks to early January, but it needs to come to an end.
Well, the Armed Forces Minister, Ben Heapy, joined Times Radio this morning and said it is the government's responsibility to ensure the airstrikes don't cause regional escalation. So diplomacy and the diplomatic ramifications of all of this is a key factor. So let's hear now from Sir Mark Lyall Grant, who's former UK National Security Advisor and permanent representative to the UN. Good afternoon, Sir Mark.
Good afternoon, Kathy.
It does seem we've been talking for many weeks now about the prospect and the fear of escalation of the Gaza war. When you look at the fact that the Netherlands, Australia, Canada and Bahrain provided support for these strikes overnight, it does appear, doesn't it, that the unrest in the Middle East is drawing in countries from around the world.
Yes, I don't see necessarily these military strikes on the Houthi military bases from which they launched attacks on the shipping as being necessarily escalatory, to be honest. I mean, of course, the Houthis have said that they want to respond, and no doubt they will try to do so, although their capacity to do so is questionable. I think a lot depends on how Iran reacts. It's worth noting that only 2 days ago, the UN Security Council passed a resolution, despite all the polarization in the Security Council, as we know, over other issues, which condemned in the strongest possible terms the Houthi attacks, demanded the release of the ship that they've taken hostage, and took note of the right of member states to take action to protect both their ships and shipping more generally. So that resolution was not blocked by Russia or China, wasn't voted against by Algeria, the Arab member of the Security Council. So the Houthis do not have many supporters internationally, only really Iran. So there's no reason, unless Iran decides to escalate following these strikes, why this should lead to a wider escalation of the conflict in the Middle East.
Well, that's fascinating analysis, and there's lots of points I want to draw out from it. You talk about the Houthis' capacity to respond being limited. Just expand on that a little bit. You think they would like to respond, but they don't have the capacity, and just tell me what you're basing that on.
Well, I'm sure they would like to respond, but I would hope that these strikes, which were, proportionate and limited, but nonetheless quite widespread against command centers, against arms depots, against the sites that launched these drone and missile attacks against shipping, would have been quite significantly degraded by these attacks. Now, of course, the Houthis are very resilient. They've been bombed by the Saudis and others for the last 10 years and have survived. But nonetheless, I would hope that some of their military capacity has been damaged. And a lot of that military capacity comes from Iran. Now, Iran could rearm them, of course, but that would take some time. So I don't think necessarily, even if they had the desire, which I'm sure they do have, to respond, it would necessarily take a shape different from what they've tried so far.
Well, that was my other question, was about Iran, because clearly their reaction is all important. The conventional wisdom in diplomatic circles seems to be that Iran doesn't want to sort of pile into this whole dispute. Do you share that wisdom, or would you challenge it?
No, I do share it. I mean, we're 3 months into the Gaza crisis, and Iran has so far used its proxies, certainly through Hezbollah, through the Houthis, and through some of the sort of rebel groups in Iran and Iraq and Syria, but nonetheless has not requested, demanded, or encouraged those proxies around the region to launch full-scale attacks on Israel as they could have done. And particularly, I'm thinking of Hezbollah. So although one should never rule out the risk of escalation, I don't see any signs that Iran itself wants to get involved in a full-scale war with Israel, which they know would draw in the United States.
And fascinating that you don't see these overnight strikes as escalatory in themselves. I mean, clearly what the Houthis want is the war in Gaza to end. And, the UK government has made quite clear that they can't be held to ransom by the Houthis. But there is some distancing going on, isn't there? Both the UK government, the Labour leader, and also the US just putting a bit of distance between themselves and Israel as the war in Gaza has escalated within that strip?
Well, certainly. I mean, if there were a ceasefire today in Gaza, that would take away any justification of the Houthis attacking shipping in the Red Sea. But let's be clear. I mean, although the Houthis' motivation may be to join in the sort of axis of resistance against Israel and the West, they haven't targeted just ships linked to Israel. They've targeted shipping more generally. And so they have their own interest in causing problems and profiling themselves internationally. But you're absolutely right that the West's language towards Israel is becoming harsher, and rightly so, in my view, because there is no sign of Netanyahu sort of drawing this military operation in Gaza to a close.
Yeah.
He's talking about it going for several months longer, at a time when, if you remember, Antony Blinken before Christmas was saying, well, maybe another few weeks to early January, but it needs to come to an end.
Well, just finally, on that point about Israel's conduct, we've obviously got Israel accused of genocide in the International Court of Justice. Do you see a likelihood, as many legal experts do, that there will be some kind of interim order to try and stop them fighting? How do you think they might respond to that if that was to happen?
Well, I think they would ignore that if it came about. I'm not sure that there will be a judgment for them to stop as an interim measure. Of course, the ICJ rulings are legally binding, a bit like the UN Security Council resolutions, but they are not enforceable. And just as Israel has ignored the resolution that was adopted with, America not blocking, abstaining on a resolution, calling at the end of December, calling for immediate humanitarian pauses, they ignored that. I'm sure that they would ignore an ICJ ruling.